Today is Sunday, January 25th, 2026. The time is 7:01 p.m. Eastern. Welcome to Geopolitical Updates from AGI Era. The global economic landscape is bracing for potential turbulence following a stark warning from the U.S. president. Tensions between the United States and Canada have dramatically escalated over concerns regarding Canada's evolving trade relationship with China. President Trump has issued a direct threat of 100% tariffs against Canadian goods if Ottawa proceeds with any new trade agreements with Beijing. This ultimatum, delivered amid an already fragile global economic climate, signals a significant hardening of American protectionist policies and could trigger a substantial reordering of supply chains across North America and beyond. The implications of such a move extend far beyond bilateral trade, potentially impacting global manufacturing, commodity markets, and the broader strategic alignment of Western economies. The threat itself highlights a deepening rift in what has historically been one of the world's most stable and integrated economic partnerships. Turning our attention to Eastern Europe, recent reports indicate that trilateral talks between Kyiv, Moscow, and Washington have commenced, marking the first direct engagement between these parties since the full-scale invasion of Ukraine in 2022. While details remain sparse, the mere fact of these discussions suggests a potential, albeit nascent, pathway toward de-escalation, or at least a framework for managing the ongoing conflict. The international community will be closely monitoring these developments for any signs of a diplomatic breakthrough. In a separate development, Myanmar's election has concluded, with a party backed by the ruling generals poised for a landslide victory. Many opposition parties were reportedly banned, and significant portions of the country, embroiled in civil war and widespread fear, did not participate in voting. Critics are labeling the process a sham, raising serious questions about the legitimacy of the results and the future of democratic governance in the nation. This outcome is expected to further entrench military rule and exacerbate the internal conflict. Moving to the African continent, Mozambique is grappling with what authorities are describing as the worst floods in a generation. Teams from Brazil, South Africa, and the UK are currently assisting with rescue efforts as people cling to treetops in desperate attempts to survive the rising waters. The scale of the humanitarian crisis is immense, with countless individuals displaced and infrastructure severely damaged. International aid organizations are mobilizing to provide urgent assistance. In Europe, French authorities have taken the captain of a suspected Russian shadow tanker into custody. The vessel, identified as the Grinch, was seized in the Mediterranean Sea on Thursday. This action underscores the ongoing international efforts to enforce sanctions against Russia and to monitor illicit shipping activities that may be circumventing global restrictions. The incident could further strain diplomatic relations between France and Russia. Finally, in a significant security operation, Germany has arrested a suspected Hamas member over an alleged plot to attack Jewish and Israeli institutions across Europe. Prosecutors allege the Lebanese man was involved in planning these attacks, highlighting the persistent threat of international terrorism and the ongoing vigilance required to counter such threats. This arrest signals a renewed focus on preempting potential acts of violence on European soil. The U.S. President's recent announcement regarding potential 100% tariffs on Canadian imports, should Canada pursue trade deals with China, represents a critical juncture in North American and global trade relations. While direct context from Al Jazeera and Al Monitor regarding this specific ultimatum was not immediately available, the broader implications of such a protectionist stance can be analyzed through their typical coverage of global economic shifts and regional power dynamics. The U.S., under its current administration, has consistently articulated a policy aimed at disentangling Western supply chains from what it perceives as over-reliance on China. This current threat against Canada is not an isolated incident, but rather a clear extension of this established geopolitical and geoeconomic strategy. For Washington, the primary objective is to safeguard national security interests and maintain economic competitiveness by limiting China's influence, particularly in critical sectors. The proposed tariffs, if implemented, would be designed to coerce Ottawa into aligning more closely with Washington's trade policy vis-à-vis Beijing. From an economic standpoint, the impact on Canada would be severe and immediate. A 100% tariff would effectively double the cost of Canadian goods entering the U.S. market, rendering many Canadian exports uncompetitive. Industries such as automotive, agriculture, and raw materials, which form the backbone of Canada's export economy to the U.S., would face devastating consequences. This could lead to widespread job losses, significant contractions in economic output, and a substantial devaluation of the Canadian dollar. Furthermore, Canadian businesses that rely on integrated supply chains with U.S. partners would experience massive disruptions, potentially forcing them to relocate operations or source materials from more expensive domestic or U.S.-based suppliers. The strategic "so what" extends beyond immediate economic pain. For Canada, being caught between its largest trading partner, the U.S., and a rising economic power like China, presents an intractable dilemma. Ottawa has been seeking to diversify its trade relationships to reduce its historical dependence on the U.S. market. China, with its vast consumer base and burgeoning demand for natural resources and agricultural products, represents an attractive alternative. However, the U.S. ultimatum effectively curtails Canada's sovereign right to forge independent trade agreements, placing it in a precarious position. This could foster resentment within Canada and potentially push it to seek deeper economic ties with other global partners, even if such moves are fraught with risk. From a global balance of power perspective, this U.S. action reinforces a trend towards economic blocs and away from a truly globalized trading system. It signals to other nations that forging closer economic ties with China could come at the cost of favorable access to the U.S. market. This pressure could force developing nations and middle powers to choose sides, potentially exacerbating geopolitical fragmentation. Regional powers, often covered by Al-Monitor, frequently navigate these complex geopolitical currents, balancing their economic interests with the demands of larger global players. Such a move by the U.S. also risks undermining the principles of free trade and open markets that have underpinned much of the post-World War II global economic order. The long-term consequences could include a balkanization of the global economy, where trade is increasingly dictated by geopolitical alliances rather than purely economic efficiencies. This shift could lead to higher costs for consumers, reduced innovation due to fragmented research and development, and increased volatility in international markets. The U.S. move is a powerful assertion of economic power, designed to reshape global trade in its strategic interests, but it carries the inherent risk of alienating key allies and accelerating a global economic decoupling that could prove detrimental to all. The narrative often presented in regional outlets like Al Jazeera and Al-Monitor would likely emphasize how such actions by major powers disproportionately affect smaller economies and contribute to global instability. This could further solidify calls for greater self-reliance and regional economic integration outside of the dominant U.S.-centric framework. Today's key takeaways include the heightened trade tensions between the U.S. and Canada, spurred by potential Canadian deals with China, and the initial steps towards trilateral peace talks concerning the Ukraine-Russia conflict. For your watch list over the next 24 hours, first, monitor any official responses from Ottawa regarding the U.S. tariff threat. Specifically, look for statements from Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney or the Canadian Trade Minister that indicate a shift in their China trade strategy. Second, keep an eye on developments from the trilateral discussions on Ukraine. Any official readouts or statements from Kyiv, Moscow, or Washington could signal progress or a lack thereof in finding a diplomatic path forward.